Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great, good. Just a friendly reminder, the Redneck Preppy is also available on Odyssey and Rumble. There are links in the description below. New military surplus collectors, particularly of American firearms, but you'll see it in the firearms of other countries as well, probably notice that their collections abruptly change from one designation scheme to another and may not know how it works. I figured I'd address it in a video to hopefully clarify it for those who are in the dark. Now, for most of relatively modern military history, firearms were generally designated as a model of, along with the year of acceptance or introduction. An example would be the model of 1763 Charleville musket used by France, which will shock you. It was introduced in 1763. Now, not all countries use this way of designating firearms. The British notably used a system called patterns. So you could have a firearm like the British land pattern musket, what most of us today know as a Brown Bess. But in that family, you also had the India pattern, the short land pattern, the sea service pattern, among others. They were all basically the same musket, but with differences depending on who was to use it. Now, the British later added on the marks and numbers system, not dissimilar to modern ways of designation, to help differentiate different versions of a weapon. Notable changes would trigger a change in the mark, but if they were really big, sometimes even the number changed. Now, for the rest of the world, you'd generally see the addition of a year to the designation if there was an alteration that someone decided made the firearm substantially different. Think the Mosin Nagant M9130, which of course began life as the M91 and saw some upgrades in 1930 to give it a new designation. Or another example, the Gewehr 7184. Now, from its time as a collection of British colonies to about a century ago, the American military also tended to use the model of designation for a firearm accepted into service along with its year of introduction. So the model 1855 Springfield musket, or M1855, was accepted, again, not surprisingly, in 1855. Now, for some collectors, that can lead to confusion when several different firearms are all accepted into service in the same year. One of the more notable examples was in China, where they accepted a rifle, carbine, and light machine gun all in the same year, 1956, leading to 3 different firearms being designated the Type 56. Now, on July the 1st, 1925, the United States Army, the Navy and the Marine Corps use their own system, and I'm going to go over that later, adopted a new system of weapons designation, one that makes the lives of milsurp collectors in the future a little more difficult. It was known as the Ordnance Nomenclature System, but these days it's known as the Army Nomenclature System. It was basically done to simplify categorizing the Army's equipment. Now, if you hate yourself, there is a link in the description to the latest version of the system. And don't say I didn't warn you if you actually read it. First, the Army decided that all equipment was to be classified by type. Now, types can include things like rifles and carbines, projectiles, pistols, grenades, main battle tanks, or bayonets, among many other types of equipment. Now, for our purposes, since I dwell in the world of firearms, most of what we're going to talk about today pertains to small arms. If you want to learn how to designate fuses or nuclear weapons, you're going to have to go somewhere else. Now, any type of equipment that is in current use usually starts with an M, which stands for model. That prefix indicates a standard model. So think things like rifle caliber 5.56 millimeter M16 or carbine caliber 5.56 millimeter M4. Now, oftentimes a piece of equipment will go through an iterative process of improvement after adoption, so you'll commonly see the suffix A, which means alteration. To take an example we just mentioned, the common M4A1 carbine. The weapon's designation is literally Carbine Model 4 Alteration 1. That means after it was accepted as the M4, the fourth carbine to be accepted into service under this nomenclature system, its design was altered sufficiently that it became a distinct version from the original M4. This system should explain to people why the M16 was followed by the M4. One is a rifle, one is a carbine. Different kinds of weapons. Now, obviously, equipment doesn't just simply spring to life. During the experimentation and testing process, equipment usually carries the prefix of XM, denoting an experimental model in development which hasn't made it to standard production. As that equipment continues to iterate in design and testing, you'll often see a suffix of E and a version number. So you could have a rifle that's designated XM1E2, meaning it's a piece of equipment in development and it's in its second iteration. So here's a fictitious example to explain how this can work in the real world. Let's say we had an M18A3 rifle. So the designation would be Rifle Model 18 Alteration 3. The Army decides that it wants to make some changes to this rifle, so they come up with an experimental model. So you would then add E1 to end up with the M18A3E1 rifle. Now, if this new Wunderwaffen is accepted into service, you would end up with an M18A4. Or to start something completely new, take our earlier example of the M16. In 1965, when the United States Army began to issue the rifle to soldiers in the field, notably Vietnam, it was designated the XM16E1. It wasn't until 2 years later that it received the designation of M16A1, that A1 being the alteration coming in the form of a chrome-lined bore and chamber, among some other modifications. The rifle survived in that form until 1983, when the M16A2 was accepted by the American military, which has some, among other changes, a thicker barrel. Now, the super geniuses of you are now holding up a hand and saying, well, what about the T designation, Redneck? Well done. During World War II, T numbers were used for experimental equipment. For instance, if there was a T2 model and then it was standardized, it became the M2. There could be T3 to T6 that weren't adopted, but then be followed by an adopted M7. Now, while this system was usually followed, there were exceptions. And speaking of exceptions, the Army's current system can occasionally be broken. To replace the M4 carbine, you would be assuming that the next one would be designated the M5 carbine, and you'd be right. Except that the Army bumped up into a force even more powerful than they are, Colt Industries. The company makes an M5 carbine, so the Army had to designate their new Sig Sauer carbines as the M7 carbine. And no, I have no idea what the M6 carbine is. Now, earlier I mentioned that the Navy and Marine Corps use their own system. Now, like the Army, the Navy also classifies equipment according to type. So obviously they tend to use different equipment, so you'd have things like handguns, but also torpedoes and bombs and, the like. Any equipment that has been accepted into use receives a MARC designation in the Navy, while experimental and developmental equipment uses the EX designation. Now, if experimental equipment is adopted into service, it will receive that MARC prefix, but it'll actually keep its original EX number. So that means that you can see equipment with very high numbers after the MARC, as the Navy will often test a large number of experimental items to make their decision which to adopt. Then when that is replaced, you could actually see something with a lower MARC number. Where the Army uses alteration, or A, the Navy uses mod, which stands for modification. Mod numbers always start at 0, and if the EX item gets adopted into service, the mod number will be set to 0. Now, remember when I said earlier that the Type 56 was an example of what happened when a military accepted into service several platforms in the same year? Well, obviously the same thing can happen with this M system, though you usually see it at the beginning of such a nomenclature system. The American military in World War II simultaneously used the M1 Garand, the M1 Carbine, and the M1 Thompson. And yes, I know the Thompson was originally the M1928, but it was redesignated under the system. So, I suppose if an infantry soldier in the 2nd was told he'd be issued an M1, he probably still didn't know what he was going to be getting. Now, that doesn't happen now since, through time, different platforms are typically retired and introduced at different times. Now, it's a little outside the purview of this video, but I'm sure some of you are wondering what happened to or where are rifles like the M9. Well, in the description below, I'm going to link to a video that Forgotten Weapons did back in September of 2022, where Ian McCollum goes through the mysterious M2 to M13 rifles. You're welcome. At any rate, I hope you found today's video to be vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. As always, I hope you have a fantastic day. Take care, and bye-bye.